Hello, I'm Krishna Lewis, the director of the fellowship program at the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research. And on behalf of Professor Henry Louis Gates, Jr., and all of us at the center, it's a pleasure to welcome you to Martha S. Jones's Du Bois virtual lecture this afternoon. During the lecture, please write your questions in the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and we ask that you keep them brief so that we can incorporate as many as possible. Now it is my pleasure to say a few words about Tracy K. Smith, who will introduce Professor Jones. Tracy K. Smith is a Susan S. and Kenneth L. Wallach Professor at Harvard's Radcliffe Institute and Professor of English and of African and African American Studies here at Harvard. From 2017 to 2019, Professor Smith served 2 terms as Poet Laureate of the U.S., and during this time, she launched the amazing podcast, The Slowdown. She received the 2012 Pulitzer Prize in Poetry for Life on Mars, and this is among many other prestigious awards her writing has earned. Such Color, New and Selected Poems, her most recent book, was published last month. So please welcome Tracy Smith.
Thank you. It's my honor to introduce today's guest, Professor Martha S. Jones. And I want to preface her bio by simply saying Vanguard is a book that reminds us, I believe, that we aren't alive among many disparate and disconnected movements and efforts for change. This book threads the needle, reminding us of all the many voices that have been effaced, but that have played a really pivotal role in connecting one moment's struggle to another. And this is a book that speaks so beautifully across communities and vocabularies. And I'm so delighted to be present today to listen and to engage. Professor Martha S. Jones is the Society of Black Alumni Presidential Professor, Professor of History, and a professor at the SNF Agora Institute at the Johns Hopkins University. She's a legal and cultural historian whose work examines how Black Americans have shaped the story of American democracy. She's the author of Vanguard, How Black Women Broke Barriers, Won the Vote, and Insisted on Equality for All, which was published in 2020 and selected as one of Time's 100 must-read books for 2020. Her 2018 book, Birthright Citizens, A History of Race and Rights in Antebellum America, was a winner of the Organization of American Historians Liberty Legacy Award, Best Book in Civil Rights History. The American Historical Association Littleton-Griswold Prize for the Best Book in American Legal History, the American Society for Legal History John Phillip Reid Book Award for the Best Book in Anglo-American Legal History, and the Baltimore City Historical Society Scholars Honor for 2020. Professor Jones is also the author of All Bound Up Together, The Woman Question in African American Public Culture from 1830 to 1900, which was published in 2007. And she's a co-editor of Toward an Intellectual History of Black Women, published in 2015, together with numerous articles and essays. Professor Jones is a public historian writing for broader audiences at places like the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Atlantic, and elsewhere. And she's an exhibition curator for Reframing the Color Line and Proclaiming Emancipation at the William L. Clements Library. She's an expert consultant for museum, film, and video productions with the Smithsonian's National Portrait Gallery, the Charles Wright Museum of African American History, PBS American Experience, the Southern Poverty Law Center, Netflix, and Art in France, which simply means that this is a voice and a mind that is raising the level of discourse across contexts and media, and at a time when we're turning in so many different directions for information, consolation, and intervention. Professor Jones holds a PhD in history from Columbia and a JD from the CUNY School of Law, which bestowed upon her the degree of Doctor of Laws honoris causa in 2019. Prior to her academic career, she was a public interest litigator in New York City and recognized for her work as a Charles H. Revson Fellow on the Future of the City of New York at Columbia University. Professor Jones is an immediate past co-president of the Berkshire Conference of Women Historians, and today serves on the boards of the Society of American Historians, the National Women's History Museum, the U.S. Capitol Historical Society, the JHU Press, the Journal of African American History, and Slavery and Abolition. And her lecture today is entitled Thick Women and the Thin 19th Amendment, and it'll be followed by a moderated Q&A session.
Thank you so much. I want to just take a moment to thank the Hutchins Center and Professor Gates for the opportunity to talk with you all this afternoon, and for continuing to lift up the work of so many of us, but for me in particular, lifting up the lives of the women that I chronicle in Vanguard. Thank you to Professor Tracy K. Smith for gracing this occasion with her presence and with that introduction. Before we went live, I was fangirling a little bit. I'm going to try and rein it in because I know we have serious work to do. I also want to thank the Georgetown Law School Center for the Constitution and the Supreme Court Historical Society. Both of those entities supported the research that I'm going to be speaking about today. Now, as many of you know, 2020 marked 100 years since ratification of the 19th Amendment, the so-called Women's Suffrage Amendment. And the year was a chance to reflect upon the force of women in American politics and governance, in a sense, to take stock of how far we've traveled and how far we have to go. It was also an occasion for commemoration, memorialization, and for historians like me, it was really a chance to teach. We had ready-made audiences for histories that too oftentimes reside at the margins. The stories of how the amendment figured in the saga of American democracy found new audiences in 2020, people who were eager to understand the past of women's voting rights. Looking back, I can say this wasn't always easy. The story of the 19th Amendment, especially the disappointments of the Black women whom I'll introduce to you today, those stories don't fit easily alongside celebrations. And while 2020 marked the centennial of the 19th Amendment, it was also a year for acute reckoning. Perhaps the history I'll share with you today is more apt for our time than I might have imagined when I began this research. Let me turn to the extraordinary Fannie Lou Hamer to get our discussion started. Mrs. Hamer was a force in the movement that won finally in 1965, the Voting Rights Act. She often shared her story of her time as a sharecropper, her work as a voting rights organizer, and the brutality to which she was subjected in that work. Mrs. Hamer was maimed by police who intercepted her small team after they tried to register to vote in June of 1963. Later, she revealed that she'd been sexually assaulted during those harrowing days she spent in the Winona, Mississippi jail. When Mrs. Hamer spoke about voting rights, she invoked her trials in those gritty trenches of Mississippi. She also invoked the Constitution. The refusal of Black ballots was an offense, as she put it, based upon the violation of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments. Mrs. Hamer aimed to compel the nation to make good on those amendments, and to her, the Constitution mattered. And still, she did not speak of the 19th Amendment. Yes, she was a woman, but Fannie Lou Hamer did not see the Women's Suffrage Amendment as protecting her. For Mrs. Hamer, the 19th Amendment was a thin promise of women's equality before the Constitution, so thin that it excluded Black women from Mississippi from its protections. Hadn't lawmakers written the word white into its terms with a sort of invisible ink? The right of white citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the United States or by any state on account of sex. The amendment anticipated that from 1920 onward, in many states, Black women would be disenfranchised, much as their husbands, fathers, and sons had been since the 1890s. Thin, indeed. Today, scholars debate Fannie Lou Hamer's interpretation of the 19th Amendment, though they don't always cite her. One view of the amendment is of a thin amendment, an amendment that merely barred states from enforcing laws that prohibited women's votes. Another view is that of the amendment as thick, as undergirding women's entitlement to a broad panoply of universal human rights. These are normative analyses, as we might expect coming from scholars who urge how we should understand the 19th Amendment today. But as a historian, my question is not quite this one. Instead, I aim to recover how Black women themselves have regarded the legal scholar's question. Through their political deliberations, public writing, and personal recollections, Black women tell another story about the thin 19th Amendment. They, will learn, understood how racism delimited the amendment well before it was promulgated. Once part of the Constitution, they experienced firsthand how it fell short. For these women, those whose political power was limited by both racism and sexism, the 19th Amendment was thin. My talk takes the point of view of Mrs. Hamer and others of the Black women who looked to secure voting rights from the Civil War through ratification in 1920 and on to passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. We learn how racism rendered the 19th Amendment paper thin, allowing suppression of Black women's votes by law and by violence. White suffragists and lawmakers alike produced language that offered the thinnest possible protection of women's votes. Whatever our aspirations for the 19th Amendment today, this history asks us to contend with how it did not, how it could not figure importantly in the political lives of Black women. A starting place for the story of the 19th Amendment is the politically charged years just after the Civil War. A revolution was unfolding beyond battlefields on the floor of Congress and in the text of the Constitution itself. It began with the 1865 abolition of slavery by the 13th Amendment. How then would Black Americans fit in a constitutional scheme that had not envisioned the US as an interracial democracy? Did freedom come with citizenship? Did citizenship promise the vote? A joint committee of Congress thrashed out these issues over many months, and lawmakers were not alone. An old radical coalition also convened, one-time abolitionists, many of them advocates of women's rights. They gathered in New York City in May 1866 to chart a way to reforming a body politic that was troubled by racism and sexism. They formed the American Equal Rights Association. Often this story is told as a confrontation between Frederick Douglass, representing the view that for Black men the vote was a matter of life and death, as it surely was, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who countered with a call for educated suffrage or voting rights for white middle-class women before any others. This telling of the first AERA meeting is a near parody because it deliberately overlooks the Black women also present. Enter Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, the educator, poet, and anti-slavery lecturer. Harper also came to New York City in 1866 to face off over voting rights with women like Cady Stanton, to speak about why Black women too needed the vote. But Mrs. Harper did not immediately speak of the ballot. Instead, she began with a story about the everyday indignities that she and other Black women endured on the nation's streetcars, roughed up, ridiculed, and refused service. This is Harper. Going from Washington to Baltimore this spring, they put me in the smoking car. They did it once, but the next time they tried it, they failed, for I would not go in. I felt the fight in me, but I don't want to have to fight all the time. Have women nothing to do with this? She continued. Not long since, a colored woman took her seat in an 11th Street car in Philadelphia, and the conductor stopped the car and told the rest of the passengers to get out, and left the car with her in it alone when they took it back to the station. One day I took my seat in a car and the conductor came to me and told me to take another seat. I just screamed murder. The man said if I was Black, I ought to behave myself. I knew that if he was white, he was not behaving himself. Are there no wrongs to be righted? Mrs. Harper urged that the purpose of the vote was to correct such wrongs. Judging by her actions just a few years later in 1872, Louisiana's Josephine deQueir concurred with Mrs. Harper when she objected to be excluded from a lady's berth aboard a Mississippi River steamboat. Just 4 years after ratification of the 14th Amendment and 2 years since ratification of the 15th, American women like deQueir were awkwardly finding their way to the Constitution. In October 1872, Virginia Minor attempted to register to vote in Mississippi, and she was refused, a white woman. The state constitution reserved the vote for men only. She sued the registrar first in state court, claiming her right to vote derived from the 14th Amendment's guarantee of the privileges and immunities of citizenship. When she lost at the state's high court, Minor appealed to the US Supreme Court, which concluded that yes, women were citizens. However, no, citizenship did not entitle any American to the vote. Missouri was within its rights to deny Minor a ballot. Mrs. deQueir set Black women on their own collision course with the Constitution. She began by a face-off with a Mississippi River steamboat captain who barred her from a stateroom reserved for ladies. She spent that night in an anteroom exposed to the elements and to the unwelcome attentions of staff and passengers alike. In her soup, deQueir invoked Louisiana's 1868 Constitution, a text drafted by radical men, Black and white, which guaranteed all persons shall enjoy equal rights and privileges upon any conveyance of a public character, without distinction or discrimination on account of race or color. The steamboat company asserted that deQueir was not, however, a lady. She was said to be more like a white man than a white woman, someone absolutely necessarily barred from the ladies' cabin. deQueir was analogized to repulsive and disagreeable persons whom everyone agreed boat operators could exclude, segregate, and expulse at will. The US Supreme Court concluded that when Louisiana promised Madame deQueir that she could travel unmolested, it had violated the Constitution's Commerce Clause. Louisiana lawmakers had impermissibly regulated commerce between the states, a privilege reserved for Congress. It was a clinical conclusion that elided the indignity and danger that concerned Madame deQueir. Mrs. deQueir's claim went to the heart of Black women's politics when she insisted upon ladies' privileges when traveling. She knew that Black women regulated to smoker cars and steerage endured harassment, denigration, threats of assault, including sexual assault. Scenes in which conductors, brakemen, and constables put their hands on Black women were commonplace. Winning the vote then was a route to curing what the Supreme Court had failed to remedy. Madame deQueir's confrontation with a steamboat captain and Virginia Minors with a voting official were bound up together. The fact of one generated the necessity of the other. Black women termed the 1890s the women's era, a time of flourishing in literature, leadership, and of legacies from the generations that had lived the trials of enslavement. The decade was also what historian Rayford Logan termed the nadir of American race relation. Reconstruction's promise of interracial democracy was crushed, and out of the rubble was emerging a new regime, Jim Crow or American apartheid. Black Americans were being purged from politics and business by way of state laws, lynching, and pogroms. The convergence of the women's era and the nadir was the crucible in which Black women crystallized their distinct approach to voting rights. Black women intellectuals were at work. In 1892, educator Anna Julia Cooper wrote women like Frances Harper and Josephine deQueir into the pages of her feminist manifesto, A Voice from the South. Mrs. Cooper set out a philosophy that guided Black women through the nadir and into the fraught campaign for a women's suffrage amendment. Their insistence upon traveling unmolested, Mrs. Cooper urged, went to the heart of the nation's identity. There can be no true test of national courtesy without travel. The Black woman of the South, she explained, has to do considerable traveling in this country, often unattended. Each time a Black woman headed to work or church, visited across town or across the state, attended a convention or a conference, she bore a distinct burden. Literally, as Black women entered the political sphere, they carried with them the lessons of personal violence, having been forcibly ejected from cars, thrown out of seats, their garments rudely torn, their person wantonly and cruelly injured, Cooper wrote. Anna Julia Cooper provided the intellectual underpinnings for the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs, which emerged just a few years later in 1896. It was destined to grow into the largest and most influential of Black women's suffrage associations, with 100,000 plus members by 1920. Yes, Black women like Cooper were committed to winning women's votes and did so to combat the dangers and indignities of Jim Crow, and for which the Constitution, they expected, offered too little recourse. Thus, as the campaign for the 19th Amendment gained traction in the early 20th century, a distinct political philosophy guided Black women. The Constitution must recognize the intertwined troubles of womanhood and of Blackness. Today, we term this approach intersectionality, crystallized in the 1980s by scholars Kimberly Crenshaw and Patricia Hill Collins. But in the 1890s, it was already a cornerstone. The NACW was built upon this view, and its founding was a counter to the newly constituted National American Women's Suffrage Association. Yes, women of the Black Club movement were suffragists. They aimed to win political power as women. And also, yes, they were committed to winning, for example, federal anti-lynching legislation and defeating Jim Crow. The so-called Anthony Amendment would be merely words on paper if states continued to allow lynching to keep women from the polls. This insight was not theoretical. Black women knew how Southern states were taking just this approach to keeping Black men from casting ballots in defiance of the 15th Amendment. Suffrage politics were an awkward fit for Black women. In 1913, Washington, D.C. Women's Parade was masterminded by Alice Paul and a renegade contingent of the National American Women's Suffrage Association. It was a turning point in the campaign for the 19th Amendment. Tensions ran high through Nassau over strategies, a state by state versus a federal amendment campaign, and between accommodationists versus militant tactics. Nassau women were largely united, however, in their Southern strategy. Black suffragists were deliberately marginalized in an effort to attract white Southern women for whom white supremacy was a prerequisite in politics. Alice Paul organized the Women's Parade for the day before Woodrow Wilson's inauguration, aiming to bring the new president to the table on women's suffrage. Mary Church Terrell, the inaugural president of the NACW, was on the road in March 1913, lecturing in support of anti-lynching legislation. She took a short break to return home to Washington. Terrell was a committed suffragist and determined that Black women should represent themselves in national suffrage circles, despite the cold reception they received. Terrell joined a contingent of students and sorority members from Howard University that day and marched alongside thousands of suffragists who upstaged Wilson's inauguration and set a militant tone for the campaign that would ultimately win the 19th Amendment. In the wake of the parade, women like Terrell could not focus singularly on winning a suffrage amendment, however. Wilson was not the only newcomer to arrive in Washington that season. On his way there also was Mississippi's newest senator, James Vardaman, elected almost exclusively on the promise that he would bring about the political death of Black Americans. His home state had already gone a long way toward this end by excluding Black men on election day. Now, Vardaman proposed to repeal the 14th and 15th Amendments. Black women's fates as voters turned as much on Vardaman's success as they did on the success of the women's suffrage campaign. A year later, in March 1914, Vardaman saw his opportunity. He stepped into the women's suffrage debate. For months, senators had been back and forth over whether to put forward a new voting rights amendment. The exchanges had been heavily influenced by fears that Black women voters would strengthen the influence of Black Americans and the Republican Party. When the debate stalled, Vardaman pressed a compromise, the end of Black voting rights in exchange for women's suffrage. Vardaman promised that even Southerners could be brought on board in support of the Anthony Amendment if they could win unbridled white supremacy without federal interference at the polls. Rather than repeal the 15th Amendment, Vardaman proposed an end run around it with the addition of a new clause that would empower states in all other respects to determine who voted and how. This would ensure that they could disenfranchise Black voters, men and now women, by any means. Vardaman had supporters, and not only Southerners. Idaho Senator William Bois argued that a woman's suffrage amendment was impractical and impossible so long as the 15th Amendment remained unrepealed. Vardaman chimed in. The 15th Amendment had been a blunder. Time has not shown the colored man's capacity to participate in government or to rule the white man. While he has made some improvement, he is today as incompetent and unreliable as 50 years ago. 2 weeks passed before a final vote, and on that day, Vardaman failed, but not for lack of effort. His fellow senator from Mississippi, John Sharp Williams, at the last moment proposed his own change to the amendment, simply the insertion of the word white. That too failed. Still, 19 members of the Senate, all Democrats, voted to repeal the 15th Amendment on that day. It was a correct but hardly reassuring outcome for Black Americans. Black women followed every turn in this political drama, and it warned them of how they would be discounted when it came to voting rights. In Richmond, Virginia, Maggie Lena Walker, newspaper publisher and banker, let the facts speak for themselves. She wrote, "This will doubtless cause some of us to stop and think a little while. Our 2 US Senators, Martin and Swanson, voted to repeal the 15th Amendment." Vardaman lost the battle, but perhaps he won the war. His opposition to the 15th Amendment continued to frame congressional debates over the 19th on through June of 1919, when it was finally sent to the states for ratification. On the eve of its approval, Mississippi Senator Pat Harrison, who had inherited Vardaman's seat, moved that the amendment include the word white to make clear it applied only to white women. It was an act of political theater by which Harrison and the 15 senators who supported him telegraphed how their states would regard the amendment. Nothing in the 19th Amendment curbed the state laws that had long disenfranchised Black men. Nothing in the amendment suppressed the intimidation and violence that were expected to soon plague Black women. States would be left to, in practice, read the word white into the amendment as they chose. That message, telegraphed from Congress, was received loud and clear in the Southern states. Lawmakers there got to work making good on the promise of the 19th Amendment, the promise that they would use their dominion over voting rights to keep Black women from the polls. This first manifest, the state legislatures rejected the amendment itself. W.E.B. Du Bois reported to readers of the NAACP's The Crisis, the federal women's suffrage amendment was rejected by a 106 to 25 vote in the lower house of Mississippi after 10 minutes of debate because it would give colored women the vote. In South Carolina, even after his state rejected the 19th Amendment, Governor Robert Cooper renewed calls for the repeal of the 14th and 15th Amendments and all others enacted since which encroach upon the rights of states. In Georgia, where Black Women's Club head, Mrs. George S. Williams, was preparing Black women to register, lawmakers countered. Georgia was not only the first state to refuse ratification of the 19th Amendment, though it was that, state officials there imposed an existing law that required voters to register 6 months prior to an election to forestall women's arrival at the polls in 1920. Yes, they sacrificed the voting rights of white women to defeat Black women. In North Carolina, lawmakers got to work in summer 1920, tightening that state's voting requirements, including literacy tests. Their goal? Negro women will be placed in the same status as the Negro men. When she applies for registration, she will not be able to satisfy the registrar of her ability to read and write the Constitution, certainly not to his satisfaction. Black women also got to work claiming their version of the amendment's promise, aiming to wring out of it what they could. Hallie Quinn Brown, president of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs in 1920, rallied her members. Teach proper use of the ballot, study that we may vote wisely for our best interests. Those who have the ballot may help those denied this right. We have organized everywhere clubs to combat indifference, ignorance, and exploitation of the Negro women's vote. Women might fare better than men on election day, resisting opposition, some hope. Let Black women get ready. They may beat and bribe our men, but the political hope of the Negro rests on its intelligent and incorruptible womanhood. Women, like those of the club movement, are the ones who will bring real democracy to this land, urged Du Bois. Despite the amendment's universal language, Black women recognized its fractures. Mary Church Terrell explained, when I was in the midst of the suffrage fight, some of those super statesmen from the southern states opposed women's suffrage and the passage of the federal amendment. Not, they said, because they could not control the male Negro vote, but because they knew they could not control the female Negro vote. Black women prepared for a fight. If the South attempts in 1920 to disenfranchise women illegally for race, color, or previous condition of servitude, show that it cannot be done. Still, as the 1920 election season got underway, there was nothing self-executing about the 19th Amendment for Black women. Instead, they gained hard-won lessons about the lengths to which states would go to keep them from the polls. In North Carolina, Democrats came after Charlotte Hawkins Brown, educator and founder of the state's Federation of Negro Women's Clubs. Democrats accused Brown of circulating a letter which advised that the 19th Amendment had given all women the right of the ballot regardless of color, and then urged all the colored women of North Carolina to register and vote. It concluded with a call to action. The time for Negroes has come. Democrats charged Brown with conspiring to oppose them at the polls. With the support of her school's white benefactors, she narrowly avoided a witch hunt, and she deflected. I do not hold or endorse the views in the letter, Brown wrote. Her dilemma was clear. As a club leader, Brown advocated for Black women's votes, but in the face of threats, she disavowed them in a twisted bargain, the abdication of voting rights in exchange for her school's future. In Daytona, Florida, educator and club leader Mary McLeod Bethune traveled the state preparing Black women to register in 1920, only to be confronted by brutal opposition. On Election Day Eve, white-robed Ku Klux Klansmen gathered in downtown Daytona, first a cross blazed, then men assembled on horseback, and finally a silent phalanx marched single file to the campus of Mrs. Bethune's girls' school, today's Bethune-Cookman University, to discourage her faculty, and the Black women of Daytona from voting. The following morning, the first election day for Florida's women, Mrs. Bethune headed to the polls along with dozens. They were made to wait, but cast their ballots all the same. But in subsequent seasons, Klan intimidation persisted, and by 1922, Mrs. Bethune abandoned her efforts to encourage Black women's votes. The 19th Amendment provided absolutely no protection. In the wake of the election season, the NAACP took stock in its report on the disenfranchisement of colored Americans in the election of 1920. The civil rights organization now expanded its analysis, offering new consideration of an old problem. The passage of the Women's Suffrage Amendment brought efforts to prevent registration of colored women in the South. So as the dust settled on the 1920 election season, Black women took stock of how they had fared. The national landscape was a patchwork with successes in the East, Midwest, and West, but far too many disappointments in the South, the region that most Black women called home. White suffragists soon moved on to new projects such as the League of Women Voters and the Equal Rights Amendment. Left behind, Black women built a new voting rights movement. It was built by way of three strategies: the ground game, in which Black women registered and voted when and where they could in each election cycle; a legal campaign led by the NAACP Legal Defense Fund that chipped away at Jim Crow's voter suppression laws; and the Civil Rights Revolution, during which tens of thousands of Black women and men employed nonviolent direct action to force the hands of the political parties, of Congress, and ultimately of President Lyndon Johnson The result was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, after a 45-year campaign. The women of the National Association of Colored Women's Clubs committed to this campaign and organized in their citizenship and legislative departments. But when we plumb their deliberations, we find that by the mid-1920s, the 19th Amendment was rarely an element in their thinking. The 14th and the 15th Amendments were held up as the route to Black women's votes. The 19th Amendment had shown itself to be ineffective from its outset and by design. Black women still found some rhetorical value in invoking it. In 1936, Atlantic City's Naomi Young spoke to the New Jersey Conference of Colored Republicans on women's place in politics, and she chided her mostly male audience. Many women and few men know the terms of the 19th Amendment, which gives absolute equal political rights to women. Young was vying for a spot on the party's leadership committee. It would be a first for a Black woman. Still, she couldn't assume that her listeners understood the 19th Amendment as she did. She took a thick position. The amendment stood for women's broad equality, but Young was largely alone in that view. More typical was the view expressed by a Cleveland Guide commentator. Negroes and women have often been denied equal rights in politics and in political appointments. Yet women, primarily white women, have received more consideration than Negroes, in spite of the fact that Negroes were granted their franchise before the women. Club women likely lamented this take on politics. It imagined all Black people to be men and all women to be white, but they would have agreed that the 19th Amendment had primarily been a win for white women only. Black women were still striving for acknowledgement of their political rights, explained journalist, social worker, and educator Rebecca Stiles Taylor. She too saw the 19th Amendment as most relevant for white women. To imagine that women gained full emancipation through the 19th Amendment is just as absurd as to suppose that the Negro gained full and equal rights through the passage of the 13th Amendment. For Black women, Taylor emphasized a constitutional basis for their rights had yet to be established. 2 million of the nation's workers are Negro women, exploited because of their poverty, their color or race, and their sex. Perhaps, in Taylor's view, nothing less than an amendment that affirmed the right to vote without regard to race, sex, and class was still called for. In the years leading to the Civil Rights Revolution, the 19th Amendment was not wholly forgotten, but it was viewed mostly as a change that had benefited white women. Black women needed to look another way to voting rights. In my research, there was no figure I wanted to hear more from on this point than Pauli Murry, the legal thinker who left such an indelible mark on the constitutional underpinnings of women's equality. Murray's archive is voluminous, and a deep dive reveals how her thinking about voting rights changed significantly over time. For example, Murry, as a young woman in New York City, was skeptical about electoral politics altogether. She voted only to make a statement and never to support a major party candidate. Though in New York, she could vote, unlike in her home state of North Carolina. My first effort has been to examine Murray's thinking in the years around passage of the Voting Rights Act. They were important ones for her sharpening analysis of women's equality before the Constitution. For example, Murray contributed to a brief in White versus Crook, an Alabama case that challenged the exclusion of all women and Black men from juries. It argued that the state code violated the 5th, 6th, 7th, and 14th Amendments, but not the 19th. Appended to that brief was a draft of Murray's consequential article, Jane Crow and the Law, Sex Discrimination in Title VII, which again did not rely at all on the 19th Amendment. I can't say yet for certain that Murray always took a thin view of the 19th Amendment, but at a fateful juncture in her work, she did not reason by way of that amendment at all. I'll end by returning to the era of Fannie Lou Hamer and the passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. The words of the Act's preamble are instructive for our question today. An act to enforce the 15th Amendment to the Constitution of the United States and for other purposes. In the text of the Act itself, the 15th Amendment alone is invoked in sections 3, 6, and 10, but there's no mention of the 19th Amendment at all. The legislative history is much the same. I found only two superficial references to the 19th Amendment during the floor debates in 1965. President Johnson's message to Congress went on at length about the 15th Amendment, but never invoked the 19th. And while I myself had long thought of the Voting Rights Act for Black women as having given teeth to the 15th and the 19th Amendments, I'd assumed that the reference in the preamble to other purposes alluded to the 19th Amendment. Now, this closer look has required me to rethink that claim and to doubt how, if at all, the 19th Amendment has figured in undergirding and indeed authorizing that act. So today, I've told a story in which an unlikely pair of Mississippians, Fannie Lou Hamer and James Vardaman, appear to have agreed about the thin nature of the 19th Amendment. Neither thought that it extended to Black women any substantive recourse before the Constitution. However, the difference, as we all know, lies in the normative matter that so importantly animates the work of legal scholars of the amendment. When it comes to the thinness of the 19th Amendment for Black women, James Vardaman believed it should be just that way, while Fannie Lou Hamer surely knew that it should not. Surely she would have taken interest in the possibility of a thick 19th Amendment and would ask whether it could provide a constitutional remedy for the indignities that Black women were distinctly and disproportionately subjected to. Would it remedy the grievances pointed to by Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, Josephine deQueir, and even Fannie Lou Hamer herself, the scourge of violence, both terroristic and state-sanctioned? Before the Constitution, these women were themselves thick in the meaning that sociologist Tressie McMillan Cottom has given that term. Thick are our bodies, but thick also are our minds and our political ambitions. They threatened to take up space that was not built or intended to accommodate Black women. Black women are perhaps too thick to fit within a 19th Amendment that was not written for them. Still, for Black women, being thick is a practice which includes crafting our own stories, our own political philosophies, our own distinct views of voting rights and of the Constitution, with which today's stewards of the 19th Amendment must contend. For the 19th Amendment to take on a thick influence on 21st century jurisprudence, it must accommodate the thickness of Black women. It must extend far enough to remedy their and our historical concerns as expressed during the struggle to win it. When the 19th Amendment provides a recourse for the violence that has ended the lives of women like Sandra Bland, Breonna Taylor, and girls like Ma'Khia Bryant, among so many others, that will be thick indeed. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much. It's such a powerful reminder of these terms and values. I love the thick influence that you leave us with. And on my mind, I go back to something that you write early in Vanguard, which is the birth of Black political culture was linked to the troubles wrought by racism. The weight of discrimination was counterbalanced by the pride of self-making. And I think of Black self-making and community making as something that's an enlarging vision of democracy. So listening to you talk about the 1920 election season and all the deliberate loopholes that were designed to ensure that Black women would be defeated at the ballot, I would love to hear you talk a little bit toward 2020 and 2021 and what we're witnessing as a ramping up of voter suppression efforts, and also this galvanizing thick presence of Black women scholars and activists who are speaking and making against them.
Yeah, thank you for that. Because I think, as I hope I conveyed, Vanguard is written very much in anticipation of this centennial of the 19th Amendment. But I am naive, as I think many of us were, about how consequential how inextricably Black women's politics would be linked to the political fates of the fall of 2020 into the winter of 2020. So my editor would not forgive me if I didn't say first week of December, the paperback of Vanguard is being released with a new preface that will bring us up and through those important contests. There is something eerie, isn't there? More than eerie, right? There's something deeply disturbing about the parallels between 1920 and 2020. That dynamic in which the seeming expansion, right, the seeming realization of voting rights through the 19th Amendment, through the force of Black women in politics in 2020 is accompanied almost necessarily by deliberate voter suppression. And while in 1920, it was true that lawmakers could stand up on the floor of Congress, they could stand up in state legislatures and pronounce their intent to disenfranchise Black women. Today, we carry the intelligence of that moment with us in our own time to see between and behind those state laws that once again are looking to keep Black women, women of color, poor people in the United States from the polls very deliberately. You know, I've come to think about it hardly as a pessimist, but as someone who better understands now, after my time with the women in Vanguard, the way in which one story of our democracy is about that inextricable tie between voting rights and voter suppression. And we are living through our own version of that as we sit here. But I expect that as we move through this time, really the inheritance, right, is one in which voting rights are not guaranteed in the United States to anyone, and a regime in which political tides determine who votes rather than constitutional precepts or bright lines.
Martha, could I ask, first of all, a fascinating talk. It was just riveting and delivered so eloquently. So thank you, I learned a lot. Where did Black women, because of the 19th, get the right to vote? Let's start with that. Because it did have some effect on some Black women, and you indicated that. But I'd like to know more broadly, how did the Black female vote shake out, you know, because of the 19th? And then I'll ask you about voter suppression and how voter suppression is gendered. I want you to explain that to me today.
Absolutely. The first thing to say is that there are many Black women in the United States who are importantly voting even before 1920, because individual states have enacted women's suffrage, importantly, California, Illinois, New York, even before 1920. So in those states, and particularly in those cities like Los Angeles and Chicago and New York, Black women are voting, and as we know through the life of the great Ida B. Wells, Black women are even moving the needle on election day, particularly in local and state level contests. And so this is an important part of the story. And for me, it's important to push back against the myth that no Black women vote, right, after 1920. But how do Black women come to the polls with the 19th Amendment in the fall of 1920 is much more fraught. And yet they do in some places. One of the examples I write about is the city of St. Louis in Missouri, where Black women are organizing, as they do in many places, into suffrage schools. They transform, in the case of St. Louis, the Black YWCA, named for the poet Phyllis Wheatley, is transformed into a suffrage school. And Black women are training one another how to pay a poll tax, how to pass a literacy test, right? How to overcome the hurdles that they know very well. In St. Louis, there are even men who show up to the suffrage school because they've been disenfranchised. And the numbers are difficult to recover, in part because those archives have been lost, we'll say. Would say they were not preserved in many places. And historian Leah Gidlow has done some of the most important work trying to get closer to the ground to understand those numbers. So I'm relying, for example, on newspaper reports, but at least in the press, it is said in St. Louis in 1920, every woman registers who wants to register. Every woman casts a ballot, black and white, in that city. But it takes organizing and it takes training, because women are going to have to actually face off, right, against reluctant and resistant officials, but they can. So that's, I think, an important part of the story. And I apologize if I forgot the second part of your question. But
oh no, the second part was no, that's good to know. I mean, so that just in sum, there were Black women throughout, I guess you would say, the North, broadly construed, meaning the West too, meaning every place but the former Confederacy, where Black women got the right to vote. Is that correct?
yeah, and so, for example, right, in Chicago, Black women are organized in suffrage clubs, come out to the polls, join the Republican, the old Republican Party, and they will be consequential in sending Oscar DePriest to Congress in 1928, right? The first Black man to go to Congress since 1901. That's Black women voting as a bloc in the way we continue to do even in the 21st century. That is a deliberate political strategy.
Yeah, and that's one of the consequences of the Great Migration. The movement of Black people out of the South when they couldn't vote to cities like Chicago where they could. And then they elect Oscar DePriest, as you said, in 1928, and his wife becomes the next Black person to be invited to the White House after Booker T. Washington, but not for dinner like Washington, but for tea, which cracks me up. So, I mean, your whole theme is how the suffrage is gendered, how discrimination, how voter suppression has been gendered. How does that work today? I mean, do you think that voter suppression tactics that all these Republican legislatures are voting for disproportionately affect Black women over Black men?
I think that's a good question. I mean, the first thing I'd say is that they are, especially to the degree that we can ferret out, right, sort of intent, right, but certainly we can understand in purpose, right, that because Black women continue to vote as a bloc, like no other constituency, it is essential, right, if you're looking to suppress the Democratic Party vote, if you're looking to suppress the Black vote and the influence of the Black vote, right, it is essential to disturb and disrupt that voting bloc. One of the things that I think a lot about is that the through line about violence and intimidation, and the ways in which violence and intimidation continues to have a gendered component. And the women I write about are aware of, yes, the threat of assault, yes, the threat of mobs, but they are also aware of the threat of sexual violence. And I think we don't talk enough about the threat of sexual violence as an ongoing and continuing presence tragically in our political culture. And yet I think this is a through line that we can pull all the way forward to the 21st century. So the answer is, I think, yes, voter suppression does indeed have a gendered component, and those who look to suppress votes are thinking in deliberate ways about how to thwart this block of Black women's votes that has been so important, and not to mention, but important to mention, right, the ways in which that reverberates not only in the lives of voters on election day coming to the ballot box, but those organizers on the ground, Black women organizers on the ground, the vulnerabilities that women like Anna Julia Cooper underscore have not disappeared from our political culture. I think they continue to be very much present.
Thank you. Krishna, do you want to curate the questions?
Sure.
Tracy, did you have a follow-up?
You didn't actually speak that much about it today, but I would love to hear you, since we are thinking about ways that this is about self and community as an extension of nation or within nation. I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about the opening of the book in which you are thinking about your own family members' connection to this history.
Yeah, thank you for that. It was a story I was shy to tell for a long time because I really took a detour from the agenda of the book for a time because, I'm somebody who writes with the portraits of my foremothers on the wall, and they sit on my shoulder as inspiration and agitation and more on many days. But as I was finishing the book, I realized I really didn't know how they fit into the story. I knew a lot about them, but this I did not know. And so I took a break to go looking for them. And that's how I discovered, for example, that in the state of North Carolina, where my grandmother lived by the 1920s, the early records of women's voting have been disappeared. And we can't actually tell with the kind of granular detail we would like to who voted, by what terms, and more. But I did discover, in fact, my own great-grandmother in St. Louis, Skip, at that Phyllis Wheatley YWCA organizing Black women in a suffrage school in 1920. But her daughter, my grandmother, is in North Carolina by the 1920s, and there was no sign that she had voted. And it was actually, it was not easy. It felt like a real loss to me, because I knew that I wasn't alone in not having managed to collect those stories, to say those stories, to recognize that Black women fit in, right, to our national narrative about voting rights. But historian Bill Chafe at Duke University had interviewed my grandmother in the 1970s, and I found the transcript of Chafe's interview, and there she was talking about voting rights. But she wasn't talking about the 1920s at all. She was talking about the 1950s and the 1960s, and this was a real affirmation of the scope of this book and my editor's insistence that we had to come to 1965 and the Voting Rights Act, because if I had failed to do that, I would have missed my grandmother and many, many Black women like her, for whom the story of voting rights must necessarily be narrated through the modern civil rights movement and not through the 19th Amendment, the thin 19th Amendment. Now, I'll tell you a thing I don't think I've told anybody, but I like to think of myself as keeper of family papers and all that good stuff. And but in my family, I'm not the only one. Let's put it this way. And my baby sister, recently gifted to me a sort of funny, sort of hodgepodge of papers that she had been holding on to. And she shipped it to me, and she said, "I don't really know what's in here, but I think you should have it." And I opened it, and lo and behold, I found my grandmother's voter registration. And there it was. And she'd registered for the first time in the 40s in Greensboro, in North Carolina. And so somewhere, I guess there's a lesson in there. I guess I know I'm saying a lot, but the last thing I want to be sure to say to other folks is that one of the reasons I included my own family was to remind us and to underscore for us that our own families are history, right? And those stories are history. They're not sidebars. They're anecdotes. They're the stories we tell over and over again, but they really are, the building bones of US history. And That's true in my own way in the beginning of this book, but I think it's true for all of us. And I hope other folks have sisters who send them unknown caches of documents and they discover things they didn't know.
Well, I hope that you reproduce that voter registration card in the paperback edition.
Yeah.
In your introduction. That'll be great. And, you know, frankly, that I think is the secret to the popularity of Finding Your Roots. The fact that we tell American history and indeed world history now through an individual family story. And it makes it palpable, you know, immediate, emotional, and memorable for all those reasons. And I think more of us need to do that in the broad field of African American studies and African American history and African American literature, Tracy K, without a doubt. Krishna.
Okay, there are several questions here. So speaking of the importance of stories, one of our audience members asks, with such compelling stories of heroism and courage, how can these historical events be used to incentivize Americans to vote in every election in our country? Low voter turnout is a plague throughout the nation.
Yeah, thank you for that. I certainly could say, as many of us do, that, and many of us know, that the heroism of the women of Vanguard imposes a kind of imperative on us to use our ballots. It is not an overstatement. It is not hyperbole to remind one another that people gave their lives so that we might cast ballots. But I think there's another wisdom, for me at least, that comes from reading these lives stitched together across nearly 2 centuries. And it is that despite our understandable impatience with American democracy, democracy is a long game. And the women in Vanguard know that. They know that, and they manifest that by working across and through generations. Many of the women in Vanguard begin their public lives as educators. And it is in those settings that they are training, preparing, encouraging next generations, because they understand that they are not going to see, right, the full fulfillment, right, of their visions in their own lifetimes. Very few of the women in this book live long enough to see passage of the Voting Rights Act in 1965. I've written a little bit about the ways in which they name their daughters, they name their clubs, they pass the torch from generation to generation by this invocation of names in a way that I think is a very powerful reflection of their sense that democracy, if there is to be democracy, it will require perpetual vigilance rather than the expectation that we will arrive somewhere and then rest. And we here too, right, with our own daughters, our own granddaughters, I think are in a moment where we are both working to transform their lifetimes, but preparing them for to do the work in their own years.
Thank you. Another person asks, what has been the role of the church in Black women's struggle for voting rights?
Thank you. I love that question because I feel like it's a setup, like somebody knows I want to talk about church. And so thank you to the questioner. Because one of the things that I think surprises some readers is that this book begins in church, or it begins with church women, like the early 19th century Black Methodist preacher, Jarena Lee. And this is important because before we get to movements, before we get to political work and social change, Black women need ideas, because believe me, there is very little in the prescribed lessons of early American democracy that would suggest that Black women should expect to exercise political rights. So Black women need ideas, they need a critique, and they need a vision. And it turns out that among the places that are critical for developing that intersectional, what we come to call in our own time, intersectional vision, it is in church. You know, Jarena Lee is a woman called by God with a gift who wants a preaching license so that she can do the work that she's been called to do. And in order to get there, she has got to develop a deep critique of her beloved institution and its leadership, who very firmly are rooted in the sense that only men should be licensed to preach the gospel. And she will inspire, right, collectives of Black Methodist women to challenge church law, to radicalize it over the course of the 19th century. And when we follow church women, we find them in the clubs, in anti-slavery societies, and civil rights organizations. And they are bringing the lessons, the tactics, the strategies, the savvy, but they're also bringing the ideas and the critique. And so I wouldn't want to be someone who says there's no distinction between the sacred and the secular realms. I certainly think there are, but too often we have treated them as wholly distinct and not appreciated the ways that for women who are thinking about how they are going to make manifest their capacities and contribute them to collective good, there is going to have to be a reckoning with the problems of racism and sexism that contain them. So this book has a whole lot about church, and I'm really delighted by the question. So thank you.
Thank you. So another question is, how did the Black women of the 19th and 20th centuries as a voting bloc compare with other ethnic voting blocs?
I think it's a very important question, and I will importantly point to the work of historian Kathleen Cahill, whose book Recasting the Vote looks at this saga from the perspective broadly of women of color, including Black American women, Native women, Latinx women, Asian women. And so I hope folks will turn to her work for a full version of this story. Part of what I learned from Professor Cahill and others is that it would not be advisable for us to overgeneralize from the important story and the important approach that Black women take to the question of voting rights, particularly in the early 20th century. Contrast this, for example, with Native American women who are still members of their own, holding on to membership in their own sovereign nations that are being undone in this very moment that Black American women are struggling around the 19th Amendment. Native women are not of one mind, hardly, about being citizens of the United States and being voters within that political regime at a time when they are losing their autonomy, their political autonomy, their sovereignty, and more. So this is an important chapter in the story where we can see how Black and Native women come to the question differently. Latinx women are regarded unevenly and differently in this moment. There is a question, for example, are Mexican and Mexican American women white or not white at the beginning of the 20th century? This is precisely the moment in which that is a live and roiling question. And as a consequence, right, Latinx women in the United States are going to come to voting rights differently, unevenly, but differently than Black American women. So it is one more example in which our insistence on holding on to those particularities shows us a complex and varied experience for women of color, particularly in the early 20th century.
You're muted. Oh,
Okay. So while we don't want to rush the conversation on Vanguard, we are interested in the answer to this following question. Can you tell us a little bit about your next project, which is purportedly a 4-volume series on the history of race, slavery, and identity?
I really like the word purportedly. I don't know what that means exactly, but purportedly. Well, I will talk about, but I thank you very much for the opening. I'm coming to you from New Orleans in Louisiana, where I spent the morning at the Amistad Research Center on the campus of Tulane University, where indeed I was at work on a next book, which is a history of slavery, sexual violence, and its legacies, as told through a family, my own family. So I'm here this week looking at the papers of my grandfather and his brother. Those collections are here at the Amistad Center. And what I was really interested in a way, Professor Smith, was returning to those women who make, brief appearances at the beginning of Vanguard, and Professor Gates, for the first time, thinking that I might be able to deploy those stories in a way that speak not only to me, they have always spoken to me personally, and they always will, but perhaps in ways that can speak to more of us. So I'm interested in this book in how successive generations of Black women whose family origins are indeed in the sexual violence of slavery, how they tell and retell, how they put away and conceal, how they transform those origins into successive generations of family storytelling over time. I'm interested in, I'm not sure yet if I'm challenging or if I'm looking to add to the important narratives that we already work through, like passing and colorism. I think there's more room to talk about the origins of those constructs in the scourge of sexual violence. And I hope that the women in my family might be one set of guides through the important trouble of how to narrate that past in the present. So that's what I'm working on now. And yes, there are a few other books on my back burner, but that's what I'm thinking about primarily these days.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Krishna.
The other questions that we have have been touched. You already kind of responded to them. So unless Professor Smith or Professor Gates has a concluding statement or concluding questions, we could begin to wind down.
Tracy? You're on mute.
How can I still be doing that?
No.
My closing statement is just immense gratitude. I've been living for this whole long year plus with the feeling history is so near, and it's a fearsome feeling in some ways, but you're reminding me of the gift of that. And these individual choices and practices and contributions are things that I want to cleave to during this time. I'm grateful for the way that you bring that out and into language. Thank you so much.
I can't top that. Martha, I love your work. It's so very exciting and so compelling and so urgently needed right now, because the past is the present. voter suppression never left, really, but boy, it's manifesting itself in hideous forms. And having spent so much time studying Reconstruction and the methods of voter suppression and how quickly the gains of Reconstruction were taken away. I mean, it is, I knew this intellectually, Tracy, but to write a book about, to make a 4-hour film about it, brought it home and you think, Jesus. And they never, as someone says in the documentary, people were the race was as high as it could be, and they couldn't see that they were headed for a precipice, and that these rights were all going to be taken away, and they were, and they could be again. So that we have to be vigilant, which makes your work even more important, even more urgent, even more relevant. So thank you, Martha Jones, Professor. Thank you very much. And thank you, Tracy, for your lovely introduction. And Krishna, thank you for being our host. Everybody give it up for Martha Jones.
Thank you all so much. It's really been an honor to be with you.
I need to think of some research project that makes me go to New Orleans. That's great. Thank you, Martha. Have a good time.
Ciao, everybody.
It's been